to episode number 85 of Gar Borras' Time Machine. Today, Gar, with the recent passing of Beach Boys legend Brian Wilson, we thought it would be fun to look back on the history of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Now, I know the Beach Boys are more around your era because they came out in the 1960s. So why don't you share with us and get us started today, Gar, how you first became a Beach Boys fan and how they first became on your radar.
I'm sorry. I got all
choked up, right? Yeah.
Okay, now, basically, I was in elementary school at that time. I'd say the mid-'60s.
Yeah.
And it was the first time in my life that I really started becoming aware of music. And really, it being, something that I was embracing. It was much before I started learning how to play music.
Oh,
but
sure.
It was the very, very beginning that was sparking this whole interest that eventually turned into this burning desire to learn how to play music, and one of those first songs that really was got my attention was "Good Vibrations." I remember hearing it, and it stood out over everything else. Not saying because there was a lot of great music that was going on at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
But it really that song was a real attention getter. At that time, and it's hard for people nowadays because so many years have passed. But if you take yourself into a time machine,
sure, yeah,
and you go back to the mid 1960s, you would be able to experience how much more limited, everything was, from all of the other stuff that's been influenced and developed from that, over time until now. So it's really kind of a snapshot all the way back to like 1966. And when you brought up, doing this, about Brian Wilson, immediately, when you brought that up in my mind, I was going back to what I'm describing right now. So just you mentioning it sparked that memory that I'm describing.
Yeah, Good Vibrations. It's interesting you bring that song up because that's one of those songs, Gar, no matter how old you are when you first heard it or where you were, it's one of those good time anthems. A lot of people associate it with summertime. A lot of people my age, I don't know if you remember this, Gar, but like back in the 1980s, many people from that time area associate Good Vibrations with being played on a Sun-Kissed Soda TV commercial, and they're like, a lot of people ever since then have associated the Beach Boys and that song with Sun-Kissed Soda.
Well, everybody has their own, first experience and stuff like that. So, they had, a lot of really good songs that just really, they were kind of dominant.
Sure.
During that time period. As far as the success that they were having, there was a lot of other bands that were also having success at that time. But the success that the Beach Boys was having, I pretty much put them at the top of the totem pole for American bands.
Now let me ask you, Gar, because you were around at the time. The Beach Boys, they get credited with kind of creating what's described as the surf music, the surf or the beach sound. Only one I can think of that might have came before the Beach Boys would be a guitar player named Dick Dale. Are you aware of who he is?
Oh, absolutely. He was really, at the height of his career at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's what I was saying. There's a lot of other artists, that were having success, and Dick Dale, was one of those few that had success where there was no singer.
Yeah. Just
and it was all about Dick Dale's guitar playing, but that guitar playing, has stayed, has staying power.
Sure.
All the way to Pulp Fiction, his guitar playing being part of this the
soundtrack.
Musical backdrop to Pulp Fiction. So there was a lot of really good talent, but here's another thing about that time period. This is a real transitional period for pop musicians. The 1960s were because previous to that, pretty much all successful pop musicians had their music written for them. They really never took part of the creative process. They were just hired to be the voice that actually went on the recording. That this song would have. So, the 1960s, Brian Wilson was one of those first, pop artists, literally first, to start becoming part of that creative process where, they're having a hand in, ideas and how this music would be recorded and how it would be layered and all of that stuff. But not just that, but also, how the songs being written and all of that stuff. And it was a big barrier at that time because both Brian Wilson and the Beatles at that, during the 1960s were those firsts. Yeah, but Brian Wilson was actually doing it, before the Beatles had come to the United States, and I think it was like around '63 or so that the Beatles they called it the British invasion, because up until the British invasion happened, everything that we used to listen to here in the United States was all about American artists. It was dominated. I'm not saying that it didn't have artists from other countries, but what we listened to at that time was dominated by American artists. And once the British invasion happened, that all changed.
Oh, sure. And Gar, you bring up a couple of great points. I mean, the Beatles were coming up at the same time, as you said, and they were what's interesting is I understand the Beach Boys and the Beatles had a mutual respect for one another. Brian Wilson was a huge Beatles fan, and even when Brian recently passed away, Paul McCartney came out and made a statement about Brian passing, paying tribute to him, and he said how much he always loved the song God Only Knows.
Well, and that song was a big, huge hit, for the Beach Boys, and so. It was just, this whole time during the 1960s, really, from the early 60s to the late 60s, really, has, I guess, you watch how how Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys start their career, and then by the late 60s, you also, get the experience of the decline.
Sure, sure.
Because see, a lot of people, it was a very different time, and there over the years there have been protection things that have been implemented out of necessity.
Sure.
Not out of being forced to have to make these changes, and some of these changes were occurring during a time where artists like Brian Wilson and artists like Michael Jackson as a kid were domineered by their parent, by abusive parents.
Sure, sure.
And so, which can make this whole thing, of course, because all of this stuff is going on behind the scenes and it's away from the public. The public really doesn't know that much about it. But there was no protections for kids like Michael Jackson. There was no protections for young adults, teenage adults like Brian Wilson. And eventually it evolved into heavy drug use in the 70s and the 80s. So by the time the 90s hit, they're out of necessity and protection for vulnerable people that want to try to have success and develop their skills. Are protected from these people, that really don't have their best interest in mind. They have their own personal best interests in mind through, vicariously through these young artists that have the talent.
Well, sure. I mean, a great example of that is, the Beach Boys music was very much in their DNA because for anybody that's not aware, the original lineup of the Beach Boys consisted of the three Wilson brothers, Brian Wilson, of course, on bass and lead vocals, his brother Carl on lead guitar and vocals, and his younger brother Dennis on drums and vocals. And then their father kind of self-appointed him the band's manager, and the band also featured their cousin Mike Love on lead vocals and a family friend, Al Jardine, on guitar. And the father was very abusive to his three sons, especially Brian, because he was a musical genius. And I seen a movie about it, and he was quite abusive. It got to a point where the three brothers fired their own father as a manager.
Well, yeah, and it was really kind of a family affair because a lot of people, the only non-family member was Al Jardine.
Yes,
and he went to school he went to high school with Wilson brothers. So we're talking. Mike Love was a cousin. You know what I mean? So it really was, kind of similar to these other family things that were going on at that time, which is what the Partridge Family was kind of based on, a family affair kind of thing, because really that was a 60s thing, and it kind of ended in the 60s. You know what I mean? Because you never really saw, family thing, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but to the same degree as what it existed in the 60s, it's dramatically reduced after the 60s.
In fact, the father, Murray, he eventually created a lot of friction between Brian Wilson and the cousin Mike Love, because he wanted to see that him and his sons got the bulk of the money, and he even tried to cheat the cousin Mike Love, and to the point where he wasn't crediting him with many of his songwriting. Years later, Mike Love was forced to sue Brian Wilson over songwriting credits, and because of that, there was a huge falling out between the cousins.
Well, it's a theme that basically very few bands escape,
Yeah.
greed.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's a thing that it's a thread that is basically ties through all the bands. Very few bands
Escape that. Yeah.
And it's the greed part of it is just as destructive as anything. It is drug use.
Yeah.
It just as destructive as ego clashes. All of these things are classic things that happen basically in all bands, no matter what the stature of the band.
Yeah.
Even up and coming bands experience that where you can have a band and one person will dominate the songwriting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And squash other people from trying to, contribute in the songwriting. It's all based out of greed.
Sure. Sure.
And so, and I, this, even bands that have had absolutely zero success still experience that component because the person that is trying to dominate the songwriting in any particular band and trying to squash other people, the number one motivation is getting those songwriting credits, because no matter what, if you have your name on those, no matter how old you get, you always get paid residuals from other people playing that song, radio airplays of that song, the song being in a movie soundtrack or a TV show soundtrack. All of those things generate money from a song, and so you can basically be in your robe walking out to the mailbox to get your check. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that was the number one motivation that I've experienced it in every single band that I was ever in.
Sure.
People always dominating and not just dominating, but squashing other people from contributing. And it's all based in that. And so, whether you're a person of the stature of a Brian Wilson or the stature of a nobody that has aspirations, those components exist no matter what.
Yeah. You make a lot of great points there. Now we should mention that the band was formed in 1961 in all places, Gar, Hawthorne, California. And, interestingly enough, that when you think of the Beach Boys, you think, oh, these guys must have done nothing but hang out on the beach and were surfers. And there was actually only one member of the band that was an actual surfer, and that was drummer Dennis Wilson.
Well, actually, Brian Wilson was born, they lived in Inglewood.
Oh, okay.
Which is really considered one of the worst
areas. Yeah.
In Los Angeles. So when Brian Wilson was born, they lived in Inglewood, and by the time Brian Wilson died, he died living in the best neighborhood.
There you go.
In Los Angeles, Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills. There you go.
Bel Air, which is the elite part of Beverly Hills. It's kind of unique.
Yeah.
To look at where he came from and where he ended up. And this is from his achievements. And I don't think that Brian Wilson would have had the psychological problems and the other problems that he had, had he not had to have experienced the horrific experiences that he was going through from the abuse from his dad, and also other people, pulling him in different directions.
Sure.
All of that stuff contributed to his psychological decline.
Yes.
And of course, the 60s and the 70s was also dominated by people self-medicating. Looking to other, methods to try to reduce the pain of what you're experiencing in your life. And so there was a lot of people that were self-medicating in the 60s and the 70s, and this is also a time period where most of the population in the United States was very, very naive about all of this stuff, that was going on. And so, he was, Brian Wilson really was a victim of, the circumstances that he had no choice and wound up having to live through, and then not really receiving the kind of help that he needed, and then resorting to self-medicating through drug use and alcohol use, and and some people are even addicted to overeating. They overeat to squash pain that they've experienced in their life. This is all stuff that there were no protections
at
or very little to protect people during that time period.
And here's another fun fact I learned, Gar. The Beach Boys had their first major hit in 1963 with Surfin' USA, and here's a fun fact. The song helped define the early sound and identity of the Beach Boys. The song's melody, I never realized this before, was borrowed from Chuck Berry's song Sweet Little 16.
Well, everybody's got an influence from someone else.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And I don't think that any great artist has previous influences.
Yeah. I mean, everybody, even Michael Jackson was influenced by people.
Yes.
Now I got to ask you, Gar, because you were around at the time. Another fun thing I came across in doing the research for today's show is very much like the Beatles at the time that we have talked about in past episodes. The Beach Boys also had some legendary performances. Because they appeared more than once on the Ed Sullivan Show. Do you remember seeing the Beach Boys on the Ed Sullivan Show back in the day?
Yes. With their striped shirts.
Yes, exactly.
Striped shirts. Later on in life, I think I even had one of those striped shirts. So just like anybody else, you kind of emulate your heroes, and at that time, the Beach Boys made those white and colored striped shirts popular.
Yeah, and and what's funny about you bringing that up, Gar, is that's one of the first things I noticed when I'm watching the performance. It's kind of like they had a unified look. They all had the same style of shirt, striped shirts. And interestingly enough, that anybody who was around that time or knows anything about musical history, you can look at a photo like from that performance, and you can tell, okay, that's the Beach Boys era from the 1960s. And it's just interesting that people are able to kind of go back in their time machines. Yeah, that's when that was, But Ed Sullivan, he was one of those guys that really had his finger on the pulse of of what entertainment was at the time, because even all these years later, those legendary performances such as the Beatles and the Beach Boys that we've been talking about are still talked about.
Well, yes, and the greatest proof of proof of an artist's greatness is staying power.
Sure.
And Brian Wilson, has his stamp on songs that are still in use today.
Sure.
2025. And we're talking about this stuff that was developed in the mid 60s. So, that is an undeniable proof of greatness.
Oh, sure.
You can never deny it when somebody's work has had that kind of staying power.
Oh, no denying. I mean, and just to kind of capitalize on what you were just saying, I came across a list of, the songs most people would know when you're referring to the Beach Boys. Surfin' USA, which originally was released in 1963, that peaked at number 3 on the Billboard chart. Fun, Fun, Fun in 1964, that reached number 5. I Get Around, which is the song they performed on the Ed Sullivan Show, interestingly enough, shot up to number 1 after that performance, and became the band's first number 1 song.
Well, and this is the label that was being put on their music at that time. It wasn't just; it was the California sound.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And their success really put Los Angeles and California and the beach and the palm trees and that whole thing. Much to a much higher visibility and much more, gave Los Angeles and California much more attention, all because of the success of the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
Literally, that whole California laid back, hey man, what's going? That was the label that the rest of the country used to put on Los Angeles and California, and there was the people that appealed to. Oh my gosh, I want to go to California. I want to see what that's all about. And then that also had the jealousy effect on other people, New Yorkers, not to speak badly, but there was a jealousy of New York about that.
Sure.
So, they used to use that, hey, man, to talk badly about Californians. So I've experienced both. The people that use that label in a positive way, but I've also experienced the people that also use that label in a very negative way.
Yeah, and another song I've always loved by the Beach Boys, it's not as popular maybe as some of these other songs we've mentioned, but from time to time I'll hear it be playing on classic radio, was the song Barbara Ann, which was released in 1965, and that hit the charts at number 2.
They were dominating. You know what I mean? Compared to, there were a lot of other artists that had a lot of success, but not to the degree of what the Beach Boys were enjoying as far as success.
Sure.
But it was a much more innocent time, and bands, like that were being taken advantage of, and bands were being pulled in different directions by people that had their own agendas and that had absolutely nothing to do with the best interest of the artists. And all of that stuff was there were no protections. There were people were naive about it and really didn't know about that. And the perpetrators really successfully were keeping it behind the curtain, so to speak, where the public couldn't see what detrimental stuff these people were doing, to the artists. And the ultimate victims, in a lot of cases were the artists. And when you look at how Brian Wilson's career went, it really documents, how adverse an effect those people can have on an artist.
Sure, sure. Now, I got to ask you, Gar, knowing your life story as I do, the fact that you started out like playing the bass guitar, I got to ask, how big of an influence was Brian Wilson on you when you thought, well, not only is that cat a great bass player, but he can write songs, he can sing, he can be a front man?
Well, at that time, it was kind of pre me.
Sure.
See, at this time was the beginning where the spark was actually happening, but I had not developed it to the point where I was choosing, which direction that I was going to wind up going. That didn't happen till later.
Okay.
I would say for me that it would be a late 60s kind of a thing.
Okay.
But I can say, Brian Wilson playing the bass guitar, made me aware of the bass guitar.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because at that time, I could see it, and I said, "Well, that looks like a guitar, but man, look how thick those strings are."
Yeah.
And there's only 4 of them. Because 5-string basses didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
And bass guitars were, had not. We're still in its developmental stages, because there were smaller basses that were popular, like the Hofner bass that Paul McCartney used to play, which was a much smaller and much more lightweight of a bass instrument. But the instrument technologic wise was gaining more technology behind it, and people were understanding how building instruments in different ways you can get different results from the instrument. And then it became dominated by the Fender P bass, the precision bass. We call it the P bass in short, started gaining its dominance, and that is what Brian Wilson was playing, at that time, was a Fender P bass.
Oh, wow. And, of course, as we mentioned, Gar, Brian Wilson was the Beach Boys' chief songwriter since the start of the Beach Boys. He has been referred to as a musical genius. And here's another fun, interesting fact that I was never aware of before. When you consider what a musical genius he was, Brian Wilson apparently was deaf in his right ear, yet he still became a master producer and musical arranger.
Well, actually, he became deaf in that ear later.
Oh, okay.
It was a decline because of a childhood injury.
Oh, okay.
To the ear. So in his early parts of his career, where he was kind of developing all the way to about the mid stage of his career. It was about the mid stage that ear finally wind up giving out from that childhood injury. But he still did have use of the ear.
Okay.
During his developmental years, when he was establishing his credibility as developing new ways to record and layer music, because he was a pioneer in all of those areas. So in reality, it was a gradual decline.
Oh, okay.
Of that year.
That's great, Gar. That's why we do the show with you, because you were there at the time. You're our rock and roll historian since you were around in the 1960s. But also, of course, as we mentioned, Brian Wilson suffered from mental health issues, which were brought on by his heavy use of drugs. His mental health issues included schizoid affective disorder and bipolar disorder. And we always hear people talking about being bipolar these days, but this was before anybody had really heard about it. They were just kind of starting to learn about this type of a disorder. And this all led to his withdrawal of touring with the band starting in 1965. So once 1965 rolls around, it gets to the point where he decides he's no longer able to really tour with the band, but he's still involved with the studio recordings and still in the studio helping them to create and everything at that point still.
Yes, yes, and it really it's basically a person with some serious problems that went completely undiagnosed, and which of course led to self-medication.
Sure, and of course, Gar, as we said early on, music was very much in the DNA of the Beach Boys, so much to the fact that I think most people are aware of it. Brian had 2 daughters, and when they grew up, they had their own musical band that they called Wilson Phillips, and they had some hits in the early '90s. But and they had their own talent, if you know what I mean. But a lot of people did check the band out simply because, hey, those are Brian Wilson's daughters.
Well, but also Wilson Phillips, the Phillips girl was the daughter of the 2 from the Mamas and the Papas, Michelle Phillips
and John Phillips.
Yeah. So it was kind of like one of those first super groups.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Kind of things.
Yeah.
So it and but then also Brian Wilson wasn't the only person that went through these hellish things.
Yeah, sure.
With people pulling in different directions, and during those times, the people that were pulling in different directions had no best interest in the artist that they're doing this to. No, it's nothing to do with their best interest. And so Dennis Wilson also suffered from that and resorted to a lot of self-medication, and then wound up becoming infamously tied to Charlie Manson.
Yes, that's a very interesting aspect of the story, and and then Dennis Wilson, I've read stuff from that time period where it got to the point where he's like, okay, this guy Manson that I've been hanging with, he's really starting to notice some really scary stuff about him, and this was before the Manson murders anybody really knew about that. But can you imagine? And then once those murders start to happen, and they were hearing about this guy Charlie Manson, could you imagine being associated with somebody like that?
Well, you can only speculate.
Yeah.
But Dennis Wilson, died of a drug overdose.
Yeah, drowning at the beach. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Or swimming pool.
Basically, drugs were part of the drowning.
Yeah.
So he had a serious problem with self-medication also, and like I said, it was a very innocent time where people really had no idea what the repercussions of what they were doing. And during the 60s and the 70s, a lot of people that were doing this were getting their information from other teenagers there, because at that time, nobody really wanted to listen to your parents.
Yeah.
There was a serious disconnect between teenagers and their parents. They called it the generation gap at that time.
Yeah.
And the whole meaning behind the generation gap was this gap of what your parents are telling you and having no idea because it has nothing to do with what the teenagers are experiencing at that time, which prompted the teenagers to not want to listen to them because what the parents were saying to them really had had every application to what the parents had experienced in their lives, but had nothing to do with what the teenagers were experiencing at that time. And that's why it became this really big gap between what teenagers were embracing at that time, the type of music that they were liking, and the experimentation with drug use, and teenagers getting their information from other teenagers instead of a good source. If
Sure.
you wanted to know about these, the dangers of what they were doing, and there really wasn't much of a good source at that time.
Sure.
There was just parents, looking down their nose at their children and tapping their toes and all that kind of stuff at their children, and their children basically listening to them like Charlie Brown was to their teachers.
Oh, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's basically what was going on at that time. There was a lot of disconnect between teenagers and their parents.
Yeah.
And so this is all, kind of associated to exactly, what contributed to the decline of Brian Wilson and the decline, at least Carl, turned out to be smart enough to kind of steer clear,
The drugs.
of this stuff. So, I think he's the only one that might still be alive.
No, actually-
I don't know if Carl
actually,
Wilson's still alive.
I can answer that, Gar. He actually died of cancer a few years ago. That cancer is what took Carl Wilson a few years ago, and so all the Wilson brothers are all three of them gone now. Sadly to say.
Well, there's this other thing about during that same time, because there was a lot of activities that were completely acceptable by society at that time. That eventually led to people from that time period winding up dying of cancer.
Yeah, interesting enough. Yeah, and Gar, also we should mention that in the mid 1960s, during this time when Brian was struggling with his mental health issues, it eventually got to the point where he really started to also suffer from paranoia, depression. And some of it may have been true, like you're saying. People were kind of out to get him. They were telling him what he wanted to hear. But it got so much to the point, the depression and the paranoia, that he became a recluse. He started to gain a lot of weight. And typically when you see a rock star start to gain a lot of weight, it's because, they're not paying attention. They don't care. They have other things on their mind. And that kind of really started to affect his life to the point where eventually, it's what ultimately led to his departure from the Beach Boys. He just stopped showing up even at the studio altogether, and they just, at one point, they had to kind of decide, well, are we going to carry on with Brian or without, with or without him? And they decided to carry on without him.
Well, and they were still able to tour and make money, but as far as like releasing albums, they were never able to reach the kind of success that they did, in the '60s.
And that's
when Brian was the driving force behind the band. So they made a great living from touring, and that touring really kind of had a nostalgic effect that just kept them popular, even though they were way past their prime. They still had that popularity that still drew crowds to their concerts.
They're still out there.
So it was really kind of a kind of a saving grace for the rest of the guys in the band, because they really weren't getting songwriters credits, to where they could wear their robe walking out to the mailbox to get their checks.
Now,
You know what I mean? That wasn't really happening for them, so they really had to rely on touring to be able to sustain being able to live, at least live a comfortable life where they could raise a family and do all the things that is, quote, the American dream.
Yeah, now the only time they were really able to kind of have any, like, have a major hit since Brian Wilson was out of the band is, I believe it was 1986. They released that first new song, ever, like I think since the 60s, was the song Kokomo, which became their first number one hit in years, off of the Tom Cruise movie Cocktail soundtrack. And that was the last major hit they've had, and so they're kind of living off of that these days. But hey, it's one of those songs you still hear on the radio, but it's somewhat controversial among the Beach Boy loyalists and the fans, because some of them are like, oh, that's too much of a pop tune. Brian wasn't a part of it. He isn't, it's not original Beach Boys, but it's that little. They had that one little moment in the sun, I guess you could say, since Brian Wilson left.
Well, it doesn't matter, what you do or who you are.
Yeah.
There is always going to be the people that can see the positive in whatever you're doing. And there's always going to be the naysayers.
There you go.
No matter what.
Yeah.
You could develop the cure for cancer, and there is going to be an element of society that's going to find something wrong with it.
Yeah, a sad state of the world.
And there's just no escaping that. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what best interests you might have, or how you're going to choose to live your life. If you even choose to live your life in the most ultimate of the most positive ways, there's always going to be someone that's going to find something wrong with it.
Yeah, I will tell you though, Gar, in wrapping up today's episode, one thing I've always loved about the Beach Boys, even to this day, because they're still currently out there touring every summer. Interesting enough, I just heard on the Channel 5 News a couple days ago that they released this greatest hits, I think it's called Songs of Summer, a number of years ago, and it just hit the Billboard chart, I think, at number one or some crazy thing like that for the first time in years. And so they have these little things like that that's kind of fun. But what I always loved about the Beach Boys, no matter when you hear anybody talking about the Beach Boys, they always think of the Beach Boys as, this fun band, the band, they play the songs of summer, and like so many of these bands we've talked about, in our past episodes, especially like bands like the Beach Boys, the Beatles, for many people, this was the soundtrack to their lives. You know what I mean?
Well, yes, and here's something that I don't think a lot of people really have thought of. But really, there's a popular thing nowadays.
Yeah.
It's called yacht rock.
Okay.
Okay. You don't have yacht rock without
the Beach Boys.
Yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Really, yacht rock is an embracement and embodiment of what the Beach Boys had created in their sound and all of that. It's really, has they really, should be tipping their hat to the Beach Boys, because you really don't have yacht rock without the Beach Boys.
Yeah, and we should also mention that in 1988, the Beach Boys were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and as far as something to be proud of, Gar, this is, I think, something they can really hang their hat on. The Beach Boys, get this, had 36 U.S. top 40 hits, more than any other American rock band ever.
Well, it's a real test, to The achievements, what Brian Wilson was able to achieve. You know what I mean? Because he is the driving force of that. You know what I mean? He's just, the guy was an incredible talent.
Sure.
And it's really just, sad to see, how his life developed, because now it's all something we can see in hindsight and learn from.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? If people choose to learn those lessons, but the thing about the British invasion is, what wound up happening is Pet Sounds was a reactionary thing to what the Beatles were the success that the Beatles were having. And I think really, if that is where the breeding ground for what that came from, reactionary, then it didn't come from the creative space. It came from more of a competitive space, which really doesn't have as much to do with the creative part of it that actually was the most important ingredient to those songs that became major hits. The major hits came from a creative standpoint of where Brian Wilson was coming from when he was developing those songs. But he was developing Pet Sounds more as a reactionary to what the Beatles were doing, and I have a feeling that's the reason why. Historically, people call Pet Sounds his greatest achievement.
Yeah.
But at the time when they released it, it really never achieved what Brian Wilson was trying to achieve, which was the same kind of success that the Beatles were having at that time.
Which is why, Gar, I'm glad you brought that up as we wrap this up, because I think down the line, to do this justice, we're going to really have to do an episode dedicated to Pet Sounds to really fully get the complete Brian Wilson story. But, I got to ask, because, sadly, the reason we decided to put together a special tribute to Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys was he just recently passed just a couple weeks ago on June 11th, 2025. Now, I got to ask you, Gar, where were you when you first heard the news? Or how did you learn of the news?
I just, like everybody else, on the internet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That seems to be, I learn about more things from scrolling through Facebook before I ever hear about it on the news.
You and me both, buddy, which is why I bring it up, because I'll tell you, I was at work that day, and I'm on my lunch break, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm on YouTube, I see stuff popping up about Brian Wilson, but there's only a couple things at first. I'm like, you know what, before I go report this, I better make sure this is true. And then sure enough, this is kind of how this is my test theory. And then by the time I get home, it's being reported on the afternoon news. Okay, it's real. It really happened,
Yeah. Basically you learn about it, through scrolling through social media sites or, whatever. And then you go to other sources just to confirm it. Verify.
Yeah. Because they do have these every so often, and it's an awful thing. You got to really be aware of this. Every so often you'll be on YouTube or something, and they have these scam sites where people, like, I was on this thing once and it said, like, the game show Steve Harvey died. I'm like, I didn't even know he was sick. And so out of curiosity, I hit the link, and it infects my computer with a virus. I had to go get that taken care of. But that's why people confirm this stuff now, because you just don't know to trust the internet. But once you see it popping up, usually on more than one place, it's usually a good sign. Okay, yeah, there's truth to the story. So this,
Well, this is just the beginnings of that problem
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, about not being able to trust
Yeah.
your source of information.
Yeah.
This is just the beginnings of that. Because with AI, and clickbait, whenever sometimes if I'm somewhere and I have to wind up waiting in line or whatever, what I'll wind up doing is I'll wind up going to different sources for news, to see what's going on. Just basically see what's going on and kind of kill some time instead of just sitting there being bored looking at the wall.
Yeah.
While you're waiting.
I mean, another.
And the thing about that is when you're scrolling and you're doing all of this stuff, what I've learned is news sites are dominated with clickbait, and with clickbait that is just a ruse to get you to click it. That's all they care about. They don't care about how you feel about the whatever the ad is or whatever it is. Because there are clickbait ads that they generate income for themselves by how many clicks they get.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a lot of news sources are dominated by this.
Yeah.
And it's all to get you to click, and then you click it, and you find out it's all bullshit, BS.
Yeah. And the reason.
And sometimes you will wind up reading it all the way to the end, where they finally admit this was a fictionalized
story.
thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now you're pissed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because you just wasted a bunch of time, through false pretenses to get you to click, so they can make their money. So if you see something, where something about this, and we asked so many experts and they all agree.
Yeah.
That's clickbait.
Yeah,
and there are a bunch of others that are basically designed in the same way, where once you wind up seeing how it's worded and everything, worded to entice you to click it under these false pretenses. That if you click it, they get paid, and then you waste your time, with a bunch of BS.
Yeah.
So that is a really growing problem of massive amounts of false information being spread to the public through these different news
sites,
outlets. Microsoft has their news outlet dominated by clickbait. Eventually you get wise to it. But here's the other thing: if they wind up doing these clickbait things where it's something you might have an interest in, as something that pertains to something you're experiencing in your life, but it's total clickbait. Once you clicked that, now your feed, your feed is dominated by all kinds of others of the same thing to get you to click that too. So they're this is all your data, being used to entice you, to get you to buy something you don't need, or get you to click something, or all of this stuff, and it's all under false pretenses, and it's all designed to either get you to buy something, or all of this stuff. But all of this stuff is dominated. Every single news outlet that is out there has clickbait that is pushing a bunch of information that is completely false and all lies.
Yeah. I mean, and just in case anybody wondering, folks, why we're even bringing this up, it's twofold. Number one, most important of all, is to warn you. Second of all, I want everybody, Gar, to know that when we do these episodes, we really do research it to get the information. And I can speak on both of our behalf that when we're doing the research, we go to more than just one site. And I can share people, another great example of this was, for this particular episode, I also sometimes will go on ChatGPT, but that's a lot newer than some of the other sites that I research. And interestingly enough, like I said, Brian Wilson just passed on the 11th of June. Well, ChatGPT apparently hasn't caught up to date with that, because they gave me a lot of information I used in today's episode, but there was no mention of his death anywhere on any of the information coming up about Brian Wilson on ChatGPT. It just was talking to him like in the present form, as if he was still alive.
Well, there is nothing. I don't care what anybody develops.
Yeah.
There is nothing that anyone can develop that is brand new on the market that works perfectly and has no flaws whatsoever.
Yeah.
That is virtually impossible. Yeah. And AI is even proving it. Yeah. Because AI is brand new, and it's showing how imperfect AI is.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So anybody that takes anything that is brand new and freshly developed and holds it to this perfection standard, that is impossible for anyone to be able to achieve, then you're not being fair.
No, that's true.
You know what I mean?
But you got to.
There is no car that is brand new that is introduced to the market that doesn't have flaws. There is no machinery product that is brand new on the market that doesn't have flaws.
No.
There is nothing in existence that, when it is brand new, that doesn't have flaws and bugs that have to be worked out.
So true.
And to do that, hold brand new things to that kind of standard is not fair, and it shows a kind of a
grandiosity.
Bias from the very beginning.
Yeah.
From the very beginning, it shows a bias.
Yeah.
So if you have a bias from the very beginning, when things are in its developmental stages, then you have your own bias.
Sure.
And that bias is controlling what you think about that.
Yeah.
And you're not really giving, new products and nothing is brand new is developed by staying in the box.
Yeah. I mean,
every new idea and every new thing that becomes developed that influences the future. It comes from thinking outside of the box.
There you go, Gar.
But that's the problem is
that's technology.
It's the people that think within the box, will always hold the things outside of the box to an unrealistic standard that nobody can live up to.
That's true. That's true.
Nowhere in our society does that exist where that can be rolled out and be perfect right from the beginning.
That's so true. You know, Gar, and I gotta tell you, this is another great episode in the can. And I tell you, Gar, we couldn't have picked a better time to record today's episode because it'll be premiering July 4th weekend. Woohoo! Yeah. So,
happy birthday, America!
Yeah, thanks again, Gar, for doing this, and to get people even more excited next time when we record episode number 86, I believe it is, Gar. We will be doing an episode on the classic horror film, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Oh, is that going to be fun, Gar?
Another time machine back to the 60s.
There you go, buddy. Take care, Gar.
Okay.